Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second part of our Sustainable Gambling Conference here in Brussels this morning. The section between now and lunchtime is essentially about how we balance entertainment with safety and how we strike the right balance in that regard. We're going to have an excellent panel speaking to you in about 20-25 minutes or so. But first of all, our key speaker on this subject, we welcome him back after a barnstorming speech in London last time. He's one of Europe's leading gambling researchers, specializing in product design, risk profiling, and behavioral insights. His work examines continuous play products, volatility, speed, and how these features disproportionately affect young adults. So please welcome to the stage, Dr. Jonathan Parke.
True rock star status. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Nick, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. So we heard quite a bit this morning about this particular age cohort, about the environment they're in, about the gambling products. What we'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about the data. A little bit, I should say, an enormous amount of data. It's worth pointing out that when we're looking at 1.5 million accounts, what we're looking at here is behavioral risk signals. We're not looking at harm outcomes, we're not looking at clinical labels. But these risk signals, these behavioral markers of harm, as you'll see, have some pretty interesting patterns of behavior. And from our perspective, it's certainly worthwhile looking at. So let's dive right in. Just before we do, I think it's worthwhile making a few important acknowledgments. From our point of view, FDJ United not only funded this research, not only provided the anonymized transaction data, but did a lot more that was extremely helpful. I mean, we put together a very detailed data request with over 100 different variables, had input from their data science team. Esther and the Safer Gambling team give the broad direction of what to look at, identified youth, the age group 18 to 25 as a key population of interest, and from there we developed the research hypothesis, we developed the approach. And having worked with Unibet, Kindred, and now FDJ United over the last 15 years, one of the things we absolutely love is their commitment to just finding out what's the truth. What does the objective data say? Over that period of time, there's been no attempt to try to influence what we say. We've been encouraged to submit our research for peer review. And it's probably one of the reasons why, thankfully, a lot of the research that we've done within this collaboration is being used by a range of stakeholders, including activists, people who are actively challenging the industry. So we're very, very grateful because it's not something that even now is very common. Okay, so starting with why we concerned. We had a lot of great stuff this morning about this particular age group. I made a note when Mary Aitken said, cyber feral upbringing certainly applies to my 14-year-old. But essentially what we're talking about is they have a digital ecosystem, unlike other age groups in the customer base, whereby play, work, social communication, how they interact, how they belong has all been done online, and specifically with digital play environments. This is where they experience games where it's all sorts of design tactics are embedded in their play. One of the other things with this age group, and lots of evidence from various jurisdictions is starting to converge on this now, is an elevated rate of problem gambling, certainly as measured by the PGSI +8. For this age group, problems, the developmental cycle of how they reach vulnerability, how they enter into disordered gambling tends to escalate much more quickly than with other age groups. And of course, given their age group, the overall journey across harm and the negative outputs Obviously, much more significant if you're starting earlier without earlier intervention. This group is more vulnerable. From a practical point of view, they earn less money. They have less stable careers. They have lower disposable income. But from a developmental point of view, their prefrontal cortex isn't developed, doesn't mature until the ages of around 24, 26. And that affects something that's called the executive function. And really what that means is behaviors and processes are really important to managing their gambling behavior aren't fully developed. Impulse control, self-regulatory resource, which is just a fancy word for willpower. Emotional regulation, how they manage disappointment, frustration, losing. And this age group tends to gamble more for escape than for other motivations. And these are the reasons why we're probably seeing more regulators starting to focus on age-specific restrictions and encouraging operators to do their own digging, and probably why Esther and the Responsible Gambling team commissioned this piece of research. So for example, in the UK, we've recently seen stakes on slots reduced to £5 for adults, but it's £2 restriction for those under 25, among many other. And of course, today we're here, Sustainable Gambling Conference. Nothing says sustainability more than focusing on the player of the future. And even if there's some cynical people out there that think, well, safer gambling isn't really a priority for me in my role, I think the number one battleground for this age group is not necessarily price or innovation and product, it's still trust. Trust is one of those areas, from my reading of the evidence, is at an all-time low. So even from a commercial perspective, it's critical to get this right. Okay, so what are we doing? Just very, very quickly. Sorry, what time do we start? The last three times I've run late, so I'm going to really try to finish on time this time.
Well, what's going to happen, Jonathan, is that I'm going to come on with a big gong like this, and when you've banged on long enough, I'm just going to give it a big
Okay.
crash and haul you off. Or we could do the comedian's hook, and I could pull you off. How long do you need? How long do you want?
Well, it's just that we started a little bit late, so I'm just trying to factor it in. But we should be good.
You're okay.
Yeah.
You're okay.
Yes.
I have every confidence.
All right.
All right.
I'm glad you do.
Okay. Well, we'll have the panel up here in a minute as well.
Okay.
All right.
So broadly speaking, what do we try to do? Given the focus now on this particular age group, we were interested in the very specific questions of what and how much. And while it's slightly more difficult to do with quantitative data, we're also interested in how, which is often better done by looking at through experiments and qualitative research. And we wanted to know what are the relationships between product, style of play, broader product portfolios, and what we see in the behavior that could indicate harm. So specifically, what are the types of gambling they're playing? What are the product mixes? What does a portfolio look like? How are they engaging? How many days? How long are they playing for? How much are they spending? And of course, we're interested in these behavioral markers of harm and how they might relate to those products, those spending patterns, and overall portfolios of play. So almost 1.5 million players across 100 plus different behavior variables. And as we said, this was broadly explorative and very much preliminary. We still have a lot of research that we want to do, and we've only just scratched the surface in what is a very interesting data set, but still to share with you so far. So a little bit briefly on data. What did we look at? Well, we wanted a range of different product variables. So not just splitting it by vertical, but looking at what are the differences within vertical. You know, different types of sports bets, different types of poker, cash versus tournament. And we looked at a range of different exposure variables in terms of spend, in terms of how many days they played. And we explored that in relation to these behavioral markers of harm. Earlier, with the work within this collaboration that we did with Maris and with Kindred, we validated a number of behavioral markers of harm by showing quite high correlations with PGSI scores of 8 and above. So we know that these aren't just noise, and while they're not perfect, or they're not confirmed cases of harm, they're very useful risk signals, if you like. And of course, given the fact that we're looking at this particular age cohort, we had access to age, gender, and also market and country. So the data spanned a 12-month window, and of course this was important because even though the data set is very, very large, a lot of products are very niche. So it was important to have enough data to do meaningful analysis on some of the less common products. But also it's useful, a year's worth of observations, you kind of get a sense of you're covering yourself across different seasonal variations, sporting cycles, sporting events. It was useful to get an overall look across the year from the 1st of October 2024 until the 30th of September 2025. And we looked across 3 markets overall, so the UK and Netherlands skewing slightly younger overall, and the greatest representation for female players was in the UK market. Okay, so what were they playing? So as you can see, slots dominated. So nearly 2/3 were playing slots. Now this is product use of percentage of those aged between 18 to 25 playing at least once over a 12-month period. The next most notable finding was that game shows were very popular among this group. So around 50% participation rate. So anyone who's not familiar with what a game show is, it's defined by having a live host, a live presenter, and there's a very, very community-based feel to it where there's interactive chat online and people talk about winning and losing both with the host and with other players. It tends to be around 1 minute or shorter in terms of event frequency, and they take a whole range of formats, but typically they tend to be wheel-based or game board-based, and you bet on different outcomes. And they also draw from some of the more successful aspects of slots. So for example, bonus games would feature in this. And indeed, some of the most important, most popular game shows also are based on successful slots. The next most important category when it comes to participation was sports betting, and I just briefly put up a cheat sheet there for what we mean by the different types. So single bets, multiple bets are your parlays, accumulator bets, bet builders, where everything must win for you to win the bet out of all your selections. And a combination bet is different in that it might be the same selections, but you're placing multiple stakes on different combinations of those same selections. So it's like a full cover bet. So you get money back even if some of your bets lose. And these combination bets, while still popular, were less popular than the singles and multis. Of interest, as you can see at the top there, esports, and again this surprised us because at least I know in the various conferences we've been at recently, esports has been raised as a real area of concern. And they may well be, but in terms of this particular population, very low rates of participation, less than 0.02% had played this in this age group over the year. A few other notes that's interesting, those betting formats that involved either a live dealer or a live host, probably where we've seen the greatest differences in participation between ages. So the younger group, 2 to 10 times more likely to participate in this type of product. And also, in terms of gender, probably looks like the gender gap from what we're looking at is closing. So a ratio of around 2 to 3 to 1 across most products in favor of men to women. The only difference was for slots and bingo, where the differences weren't too large, but women playing slightly more bingo and slots. What was interesting to us, though, was that while more women than men play bingo, women overwhelmingly play sports betting and slots. So 10 times as many women in the sample would be placing a sports bet than playing bingo. Okay, so that's the what. And this is a brief look at the how much. So what we're looking at here are indicators by different age groups, and we've just taken a selection of 3. So total days active, total losses in euros, and these are means, by the way, and mean hours financially active over the 12-month period. And one thing, I guess, is fairly obvious, is that across most of these metrics, and this applied across most metrics of engagement, in terms of total volume by engagement tended to increase over age. One note of caution, I think an important caveat here, is that we also know that younger cohorts tend to play on a greater range of operators. So we're limited in really looking at volume, what this tells us in terms of risk. And this leads us to our next slide. So we looked at what are they playing, some broad volume level indicators about how much. What about markers of harm? So here we've taken 2 of the more significant in terms of our past work and validating how reliable these things are. And it's also, when we're looking at markers of harm, it's important to look at different dimensions. So, you're not just looking at 3 aspects, 3 markers of harm that are looking at spend. You want to look at financial strain, you want to look at loss of control. And that's why we've taken these 2 just as an example. So declined deposits because of insufficient funds is a very useful marker for financial strain, affordability. And top-ups, essentially we mean here repeat session deposits, typically validated for being useful to indicate chasing behavior, loss of control, unplanned spend. So what did we find? Looking first at the total volume of how many times, or the incidence of these markers of harm, we can see for declined deposits, all these differences are statistically significant, by the way, given the size of the sample, but broadly similar. Looking at the total volume for top-ups, younger players, by quite some margin, have a lower volume or incidence of these markers of harm. But when you control for how many days they're actually playing, and younger people tend to play more days, the picture changes somewhat. So higher rates of declined deposits per day for the 18 to 25s, and while still lower, much more compressed, more comparable in terms of top-ups and repeat deposits. So now adding an additional layer, we're looking at how do these change by product. And again, sticking with these 2 particular risk signals, these markers of harm, what we're essentially looking at are correlations with active days of playing those product. So the higher the number, the darker the shading, the greater relationship with that particular product. So a few key takeaways here. The first one is, as you can see, for the under 25s, the risk profile is much more diffuse. The products that they're engaging with and the links with potential risk signals are spread across a range of different products, much less so for the over 25s. And I think the other key takeaway is that probably only with the exception of poker and just about bingo, across all of the 20 products, the correlations or the relationships with risk were all stronger for the under 25s. Now we've looked at what, we've looked at how much, we've looked at how that relates to different products. We're adding one final layer here, which is looking at not just what are the relationships with risk, but when you overlay on top of that exposure. It's like that old philosophical saying, if a tree falls in the forest, no one's there to hear it, does it actually fall? Well, essentially, that applies here. To what extent, doesn't matter how risky a product is, if we don't understand to what extent people are actually engaged with it or exposed to it. So what you're essentially looking at is, we're referring to it as a risk burden or an operator population level of harm. So what you're looking at on the X-axis is the risk signal, so that's the mean correlation with key markers of harm, and the level of participation across the 18 to 25-year-old age group. So obviously what jumps out immediately is the position of slots. Slots dominate in the 18 to 25 age group. And this is interesting, I think, mainly because there's been, at least in the circles that I've been in, there's been discussions about, is slots able to maintain the interest of younger players? Are other forms of gambling like esports taking over? If anything, looking at the data, it looks like slots are becoming more popular, basically. So for this group, the risk burden, in terms of the overall risk and how many people play it, resides with slots. Game shows is also noteworthy, again, because I think a lot of people consider this to be a niche product. And again, a lot of people don't even know what game shows are. But participation rate is surprisingly high, and the relationship with risk signals, these markers of harm, are non-trivial as well. Poker tournaments surprised us the most from our point of view, mainly because the single biggest driver for risk when it comes to product is speed and continuity. And poker products, or sorry, poker tournaments specifically, are by far one of the slowest products out there, and one of the least continuous in terms of staking. So this was interesting. On the other side, esports, scratch cards, very, very low, both in terms of participation and in terms of risk signals. And I'm going to come back to this point in the conclusion shortly. Just a few other quick points. We found this in previous studies, still continue to be surprised that we hypothesized that riskier casino table products would be the simulated products. First-person products whereby you're playing a simulated but much faster, much more continuous experience compared to, for example, live table games where you have a dealer, where you have chat, and it can be 2 to 3 times slower and 2 to 3 times less continuous. So actually, it's clear that speed, while important, continuous play, while important for risk, isn't critical. And certainly that importance is starting to change with this younger age group. Okay, so a few conclusions. And just before I provide a few takeaways, I think it's always important because this information can be misused in so many different ways. There are obvious reasons why it's a very strong data set in terms of its size, the granularity. We can look at a range of different things. And of course, we're looking at actual behavior, not what people say they do, which we know often doesn't translate into reality. But there are limitations. So the obvious one is that we're looking at correlations. We're looking at risk patterns, risk signals. We're not looking at causal mechanisms. We're not able to follow the trajectory of play and chronologically assess how this harm might be caused. Although we do get interesting insights, which I'll come on to. We're looking at a single set of operators, so we only have a partial view of how much in terms of volume people are playing. And also, we know the patterns vary by brand. Different product mixes are stronger, different promotion acquisition strategies, advertising selling points, and that will obviously vary which products are pushed or promoted, or which players decide to join that particular company. We also know that products, not just the inherent features themselves, but it's about how they're promoted, where they're placed on the platform. Has there been a recent release of a launch of a new product? All of these things can influence how many people play it and how risky it could be. And most importantly, as I said, these aren't confirmed cases of harm. This is useful as a starting point, as a map about where to focus. And a lot of that has got to do with the fact that we don't know to what extent risky people are playing these products, and these products aren't necessarily providing the harm, and that's a selection effect or an exposure effect. And that the harm they're playing, the risky profile players are playing these products, but also that's where they're experiencing the harm. That's where they're losing the time, that's where they're losing their money. So both very different. And in future research, we want to look a bit more specifically at the feature level. We've looked broadly at the product level. Okay, so to finish with some key takeaways. I think when I've heard a lot of debates, particularly in regulatory environments, online, LinkedIn, wherever it might be, this issue often gets ignored. Is that where does the burden of risk sit? And this is important because, again, if 1 in 10,000 people are playing a product, how much of your RG strategy, your safer gambling strategy resources should be focused on a product if that's not where the primary risk is? And it seems obvious, but so for example, if a recent study has identified esports gamblers have a problem gambling rate of 50%, it's easy to get drawn in that direction. And what we're finding in this research is that the burden of risk still very much remains within the area of slots. And what that means is changes to slots have a ripple effect across the whole population in terms of risk. And that happens in both directions. So if there are innovations that could increase risk, compared to all other products, the implications for player health, player safety will change significantly based on that. And the same with restrictions. I don't know how much evaluation's been done with the stake restrictions in the UK, but I'll be interested to see how much that would have an impact, because based on this research, it should have quite a significant impact. So slots as being potentially dangerous, one of the highest risk products, is nothing new, but actually the key point here is that it also applies to younger players. And their younger players are playing them now more than ever based on this data set. Just one other quick point that I think is I skipped right over. If you have a look, I just put in the bottom right there how the profile changes by the over 25s. So in terms of direction, it's very similar, but the over 25s infinitely more slots dominant in terms of where the risk signals are coming from. So the under 25s, while they are still slots dominant in terms of risk signals, it's across a range of different products, and very different products, satisfying very different needs. But as you move over 25, overwhelmingly you can see there, it's quite disarming, just the difference. And again, we're focusing here on risk signals. So again, apologies for taking back and forth through slides, but I thought that was important to show. So as I say, slots still feature, but the other two things that need to be looked at a bit more is we've referred to as player-configured decision-led. So these are activities that we've heard this before. Adam, was it that mentioned feeding the birds in Pirates? And more and more, we're seeing people wanting to share what they're doing in terms of bets online. My 14-year-old, it wasn't gambling, it was loot boxes, but he had 7 million views on TikTok by showing that he spent £50 on FIFA points and basically got 0 good players. So why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because it used to be sharing and getting peer influence and peer support was about wins. Now, increasingly, the younger age group is interested in just sharing experience. And as sometimes we all have to admit, even when people have a negative experience, sometimes we get a kick out of it. And actually, it seems to work both ways in terms of some of the younger cohorts. And I think that's what we're seeing here. But again, we have to look at it at feature level. And of course, the live host social dimension is interesting. And again, if you had to ask me a week before we did this research how important is social, I would have said not very much. We still don't know enough about it, but again, this relates to the live dealer, the interactions about winning and losing that happens both between the host and the player, but between the players themselves on live chat. And again, much bigger signals for the under 25s. Total volume of play overall was lower for this group. But again, we're limited in what conclusions we can draw, mainly because the younger cohorts tend to have, on average, 3+ accounts, where the older cohorts tend to have 1 or 2 accounts based on some research in the UK. Really, the takeaway point here is that when you look at it per session, it is right, I think, that we focus on this age group. They are showing elevated risk signals compared to other age groups. And usually, for a lot of other addictive behaviors, that's not the case. Usually, risk signals increase over time. Whereas we're finding, and this speaks to the points that were made earlier, young people are now being primed in digital play environments, rapid, random reinforcement, and they're entering gambling environments that are regulated and legal, primed, ready to go, ready for action. So the key point here is that we're right to look at it. We're right to look at enhanced monitoring and early prevention. And the final slide. So while we looked at the product level so far, still some useful takeaways. The obvious ones, as usual, we're finding the fast continuous products are showing up higher risk than slower discrete products. Live in play showing up as higher risk than pre-match. One of the things that we thought was less obvious is that the combination full cover bets, when we did regression modeling, it was coming out as higher risk than the multiple bets. So that means the bets where you're kind of hedging your bets, you've got lots of different bets on the same selections, where some of those can lose and you can still win, were coming out as higher risk. Compared to the multiple bets, so for example, your accumulators, bet builders. But again, we need to do more research on this. And as I mentioned, the live dealer social dimension is interesting. So just one final point, and that's circling back to the selection exposure debate. So as I said, the esports is a great example of this. So some very good research that was done by an academic in the UK found that esports gamblers had the highest rate of problem gambling in that sample. A rate of 50% of esports gamblers were identified as being problem gamblers. Now, what's my point? My point is that the findings in this study, believe it or not, don't contradict that. What we found is what's likely happening here is a selection effect, whereby people who are higher risk, who are deeper in terms of vulnerability, are selecting to play esports. And that's why this data set is really, really useful, because it's looking at it from a completely different angle. We're looking at it at an operator population level. And again, thanks to FDJ UNITED for doing this research. For that reason, we can see that the risk burden for this product, at least in this particular operation, is extremely low compared to other products. So thinking about selection versus exposure is very important. And of course, the obvious takeaway from that is, I'm not suggesting that we ignore esports, certainly in terms of further marketing, in terms of changes in player preferences, whatever it may be. It's important to keep an eye on it, but in terms of resources, in terms of time, it's still important to look at slots. And we have a range of further analysis to do, not least in terms of country and gender, where we see some very interesting initial findings, and hopefully share that with you at a future date. So thank you for your time. Sorry for rushing through that, but it gives us at least a little bit of data to put to the very useful sessions this morning.
Perfect. Jonathan, thank you so much. Jonathan Parke, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to ask Jonathan to stay with us, if you would. And we're going to be joined by a fabulous panel to some observations Jonathan had. So please welcome the Chief Sustainability Officer at FDJ United, Vincent Perrotin, the Partnership Bet Blocker Gambling Therapy, Pedro Romero, and the Head of Government Affairs at Play and Go and a recognized expert in US state level. Shawn Fluharty. Gentlemen, come and join us on the stage. I'm not sure my mic is. Could be, that'd be great. Hopefully everybody's is. So, balancing fun and safety. That's the key. How do we do it? And what were the main observations from Jonathan's research? We'll highlight how specific product features, volatility to speed, can drive risk amongst that. Before we dive into what stood out to all of you from Jonathan's findings. Shawn, perhaps you take that first of all.
Well, first, okay. Hey, good afternoon. Shawn Fluharty, Head of Government Affairs at Play and Go, and also for the past 10 years I've been a lawmaker in the U.S., so I've really seen the policy-making perspective. What stood out to me is it's so spread out for under 25, and what stood out is that I'm no longer considered young anymore, so that's an issue. But it's so spread out in that just because there's a lower spend as well does not necessarily mean a lower risk. And from a policymaker's perspective, if you're a lawmaker and somebody comes in and says, well, all the money's shifted to one certain segment, that doesn't mean that the risk shifts as well. So you have to be cognizant, if you're a regulator or a lawmaker, that when you have such a wide spread of spend, you can't just isolate yourself to where the most spend is, because the risk is still there regardless.
Vincent, how about you?
I think esports at FDJ, they need to look into how, because it sounds a bit like you're not great at it. But one of my main concerns is that sometimes regulators may take an interesting approach. It's oh my God, slots are more dangerous. Let's ban slots, or let's for under 25, or let's take some radical measures. So, the study is extremely important, but sometimes it's with how it's taken into context, in the sense of, okay, maybe this is the cohort, or maybe this as Jonathan perhaps was suggesting that, okay, people with a higher level of potential risk may choose this product. So, sometimes this sort of thing, even if slots is generally associated to a higher level of gambling harm, sometimes I'm a bit like, okay, is this going to lead people finding the way to this type of projects without safety in the black market if regulation goes too hard? Or is it maybe better to approach this type of harms with an educational approach? Okay, we need to get younger people to know about the risk of these products.
Well, Vincent, this has been something that we've been hearing all morning, isn't it? That you've got to get education in early. It's no good waiting until they're halfway down the rabbit hole before we reach the hook in and try and pull them out. We've got to make sure the hole's closed to begin with.
Yeah, it's certainly quite a sensitive issue. And I think that's what the studies that Jonathan just presented us shows clearly, is that we are faced with I would say a situation that we have to address. And I found that the lessons from this study are very consistent with what we know now from the 18 to 24 and the Gen Z in particular. Mm-hmm. We know from that 18 to 24 they have a higher propensity to take risk. And it's very apparent that there is a multi-clustered risk profile. But I also think that's what we know
we've
from
heard,
the
haven't
Gen
we?
Z. Maybe just to say that from the Gen Z perspective, they now want speed, they want skill, they want immersion, and all of this is somehow mixed in the different products that we have. And we definitely have to look further into that to be able to best protect them.
And to what extent, from your research, Jonathan, is that risk been embedded from a very early age? So it's that rewiring that Mary was talking about earlier.
Yeah, so a lot of my research hasn't focused on loot boxes per se, but certainly overwhelmingly all the research that's been done so far points to it does prime individuals, younger players to, we heard earlier from one of the lived experience examples, on his 18th birthday he spent 5,000 euros. They're being primed to know what to expect, to want speed, rapid reinforcement, and most importantly, random high-level rewards wherever possible.
And in terms of regulation, we're seeing prediction markets, fantasy sports, gaming platforms integrate real money features. Should these fall under the sort of regulation that we are more used to expecting in this sector?
I would say that's the biggest fight right now in the states, is that you have states who have said, we are going to have a regulated market, whether it's iGaming, sports betting. You have states that have said, we are not going to do that. And then you have prediction markets and sweepstakes coming in and operating unregulated, no tax money, and at the, up in the face of lawmakers and regulators. And yeah, it walks like a duck, talks like a duck. Chances are it's a duck. That's kind of, if you ask any lawmaker, any player, and any operator, that's how it looks and that's what it is. But now we have a fight, and I'm not going to get in the weeds on the legalities of it, but the CFTC in the states and whether these prediction markets can operate unfettered without real responsible gambling tools available. I think that's the million-dollar question here is, as we move forward with prediction markets, and I don't know if you saw the news that FanDuel and DraftKings just left the American Gaming Association, I believe this morning. So they're moving on, they're moving forward, and they're putting all their chips in on prediction markets, which could unravel when a new administration comes in a few years. So yes, to your original premise, yes, absolutely.
Pedro, where does that leave the regulated sector?
I mean, I think we need to find a balance. We need to make sure that the regulated markets, where there's more protections, has an advantage. And it's about finding, this sort of right balance. We cannot wait, sometimes until we get young people, minors. Okay, they get millions views or 100,000 after they gamble away in FIFA 50 pounds or 50 euros. Okay, look, I have worked for 15 years in the gambling industry. I know if a video game, I see it and I say, look, yeah, this is a duck. Okay, we may not call it duck, but this is what happened. You get children being primed to gamble without many protections or many restrictions. What do we expect? That once they turn 18, it's up to the regulated gambling industry to re-educate them. We need to act much earlier. And going back to the sort of original question, I think it's important that I know that this probably a titanic task, but video games, microtransactions, all this sort of stuff that they are very gambling-like, they need to be regulated at the same level, if not harder, because we need more protection for people. We cannot wait until they're 18 to do all of this very hard work.
It's one thing to be regulated the same, but also presumably we need the research and development to be collaborative in order to better understand how people's behaviors are developing. Vincent, have we got the tools there, do you think? I mean, this has again been a theme throughout the day, collaboration potentially between gaming and gambling operators, and it wasn't universally agreed when we put the Mentimeter up either. Why do you think that might have been?
Well, obviously, and I think it's the whole history of this conference to foster more collaboration. So at FDJ United, we strongly believe in it, and I'm very happy to have contributed to this piece of very interesting study, delivering our data, because there's so much we can do now and take from this data. I also think that from an RG perspective, there's much to be discussed on this. On the more, I would say, product side, we have at FDJ United, we have developed over the years tools, mainly on the lottery environment, to look at the different features of the lottery products and to see how to best manage the level of attractiveness of these products. I think definitely there's something to be done here also with all of this material, and probably to share on the wider basis with the rest of the industry, but also with the regulators, because of course at some point there will have to be a clear framework on the regulatory side as what should be authorized and what should not, and obviously taking into account the need to channelize all of this in the legal market.
Jonathan, is it just about making the tools sharper? Are the tools there, or do we need to have better tools?
Well, that's the question,
because it's so complicated as a science. So many different products, you're dealing with hundreds of different features. And you pick out 20 academics, they'll all tell you something very different. And that's why having real evidence about what works is really helpful. I think the two main products, the tools that are out there for assessing risk, there's lots of limitations. But the biggest problem is that they're nearly 20 years old and they've barely changed. Yeah. I mean, that's a problem for being 20 weeks old, let alone 20 years. And so product risk assessment has to be living and breathing. I think one of the points that I didn't make was about the black market. And so it's clear from the research that, slots continue to be high risk. Even if it's just signals, it's clear that something is going on with slots. In my view, it's a longer conversation, but there's probably lots that can be done with slots. But, at the minute, we're talking about things like taxing slots, or, the answer would never be, we're talking about balancing fun and safety. The answer would never be, well, let's make a slot 10 seconds long. Because, yeah, that would be effective, but it wouldn't be efficient. In other words, no one would play it. And you would displace, I'm not an economist, I don't know how much people would go and play in the black market if you kill slots, or if, like we have in France, currently at the minute, online casino isn't available. But that's really important because the black market, and this came up quite a lot in Mary's talk, the features are infinitely more risky, even without evidence. Much faster, higher stakes, high volatility, buying into the most volatile components of slot games instantly, and on and on and on.
And the next generation is more readily conditioned to go there. That's the key, isn't it?
Very good point.
I don't think any of us on this stage can count in any way as being part of that demographic, the one that Mary was talking about, the 14-year-old iPhone baby. And Shawn, how do we go beyond getting the operators to just comply and actually begin to foster a sense of communal and societal responsibility, which actually will benefit the operators immeasurably?
Well, we've had a lot of discussion this morning on entertainment and what does that look like. So I can tell you, for Play and Go, we believe we're an entertainment company. We believe in sustainability. We believe that entertainment should not come with an increase in addiction, and that entertainment should not come in the pursuit of profit off of that, should not come at the expense of people. So what do we do internally that maybe many others do not do, and regulators have not necessarily said you have to? The game mechanics, which you just started on. Black market, free for all. But in a regulated sector, some areas like the UK ban direct bonus buys. But that doesn't mean we're going to participate in other markets with direct bonus buys. We have internally decided we are not going to do that. And if you're not familiar, it's essentially the flashing bonus buy button on the screen and entices you to go from $1 a spin to $100, whatever it may be. We find that to be predatory. Some regulators find it to be predatory. But in the US right now, currently, now that may change, that's allowed practice. But we don't do that because we believe it's predatory, and we believe a sustainable entertainment model does not reflect that. So it really needs to be a reflection point for the industry, because at some point we're going to go so far and push the boundaries so far that regulators and lawmakers are forced to react, and that reaction will not be pretty.
Pedro, how will your technology start to adapt to that way of thinking, if indeed it will?
At BetBlocker, what we do is we protect people from the regulated and the unregulated market. And I think it's about offering people different options. For example, today we launch a new feature called the Scheduler, which help people that want to reduce their gambling. They may not be on the harm extreme, but they may not want to say, okay, I don't want to gamble after 10 p.m. Okay, so they block themselves from 10 p.m. onward. So it's about offering harm minimization tools combined with other tools for people that they are farther down the line. So I think going back to the collaboration point is extremely important, to work with charities as we're working. You're already working with different researchers, with game developers, and it may be really boring, but we live in a society which is increasingly split. Okay, people that have suffered from gambling-related harm, may not engage. We have a fantastic group that they came here and they engage with operators. Regulators, they have their own conference. So I think, having a place where we can all talk to each other is absolutely key, to keep collaborating.
We've got one final question before we break for lunch. If all of you could send one message to those people developing the next big thing in this space, what would it be? Vincent?
I think my main message would be to say that we have to keep innovating because our responsibility is to propose safe and fun entertainment, and that's going to keep. It's going to be our mission ongoing, and I think that there may not be any miracle on that, but I think that data science tools, a lot of these kind of works and studies and collaboration with researchers, also the work with NGOs and associations, because we have all our role to play in that regard, but also taking into account this new generational context with Gen Z, because if we don't, if not able to channelize them in the legal market, it's going to be even worse, as Mary Aiken said it this morning.
Shawn?
I would echo that collaboration is key and that data is essentially the new currency in the brain economy. Done some work with the Better Gambling Forum, which I'm currently chairing, and the European Brain Council, and that's where we're heading as far as the collaboration efforts, so we have a global policy initiative when it comes to gambling. At the same time, I would say that those who are working on the next big thing should not leave regulators and lawmakers on the back seat while doing so, because there's an education gap that needs to close. Technology moves at warp speed, the industry follows it at a rather fast pace, but yet regulators and lawmakers move at a different speed, and that speed creates a gap, and when that gap occurs, we have issues.
And all you have to do, Pedro, is design the next big thing.
Yeah, for sure. So, my it's a bit the same, like collaboration, Any one of you could put on your website bet blocker, in 5 minutes. If you want to help, you help. If you don't, it's fine. But what I ask is, look, there's always, ways to collaborate, to innovate, and, in the harm minimization, in research, just try to do something new. If you do the same, you get the same.
Jonathan, put a button on it for us. I know there's no silver bullet. The space moves too fast for that. But what is the single most influential thing?
I can give a near silver bullet, and
Go
it
on.
doesn't cover everything. But so the tagline is, innovation isn't off the menu for safety. But the key thing as a game designer that you think about is this change making this game more fun? Or is this addition that I'm adding a hook? Is this purely about trying to extract more revenue? And they're not always the same thing. And if we have time, we can go into lots of examples. But that's the main thing. And it doesn't mean that fun isn't risky, but certainly the starting point would be the things that we really doesn't have an impact on fun, or in some cases might even deter from fun, but tends, at least in the short term, because that's the thing that we often forget as well, is that some of these short-term gimmicks and slots or any other products that might generate income in the short term will increase risk. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I think there's even a commercial element to, it sounds corny, but focus on what makes products fun. What are the reasons people are using it for a legitimate, regulated leisure activity? And avoid the kind of cynical hooks that we find across a lot of aspects of digital commerce. Unfortunately, the Gambling Commission have to be better, the gambling industry have to be better because they're held to higher standards.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. Please give a warm round of applause for our excellent panel and speakers, Shawn Fluharty, Pedro Romero, Vincent Perrotin, and Jonathan Parke. Thank you all so much.